All right, let's go. Number 10. The Dentists of Merger. In 2006, a group of researchers publishing in the journal Nature described a set of teeth that should not have belonged to the people who owned them. The teeth came from a neolithic graveyard at Merger in what is now Balochistan in western Pakistan. There were 11 of them. They had been taken from the jaws of 9 different adults, and the graves around them dated to between 7,500 and 9,000 years ago. Every one of those teeth had a hole bored into its chewing surface, neat and deliberate, driven down through the enamel toward the living core. This is the oldest evidence of dentistry anywhere on Earth. It is roughly 4,000 years older than anything found before it. Look closer, and the craft only gets stranger. Under magnification, the holes were almost perfectly round. Inside each one, faint concentric ridges spiraled down the wall of the cavity, the trace of a tool spun at high speed. The team, which included the anthropologists Roberto Macchiarelli, David Freyer, and Luca Bondioli, matched those marks to something already lying in the same soil. Merger was a town of bead makers. Archaeologists had recovered tiny flint drill points there, used to pierce turquoise and lapis lazuli. They had found beads bored with holes finer than the ones in the teeth. Someone had taken a bow, strung it, seated a flint tip, and turned a bead drill into a dental instrument. When a modern team tried the same rig, the flint cut through tooth enamel in under a minute. The bored holes themselves were tiny and exact, most of them between 1 and 3 millimeters across, and as much as 3.5 millimeters deep. And unlike a cavity meant to be filled, they were left open, which points less to plugging the tooth than to draining or scraping the decay out of a molar that had already begun to die from the inside. So far, this is only impressive handiwork. The detail that changes everything is smaller, and it hides inside the holes. The rims were worn. The edges had been smoothed and rounded, and not by any tool. They had been polished by years of a living mouth closing on that tooth, chewing, grinding, wearing the drilled cavity down the way only use can. That smoothing does not form on a corpse. It forms on a patient. These people were awake, or close to it. They felt the point go in. Then they stood up and kept eating for years. This was not one desperate act by one desperate person. The 11 holes were all in first or second molars, teeth set too far back in the mouth to be drilled for show, which rules out decoration. 4 of them show decay around the opening, a hint that the drilling was aimed at pain in at least some cases. And it went on. The practice ran at Merger for around 1,500 years, on ordinary men and women. 4 women and 2 men among the identified patients, aged from their 20s into their 40s. The drilled teeth came from a burial ground holding hundreds of people, so this was routine, not rare. Drilling this precise does not appear again in the human record for thousands of years, not until the American Southwest, around 1100 AD, not in Europe until roughly 1500. There was no anesthetic. There was no concept of infection. There was a hand, a bow, a stone, and a person holding perfectly still, and then it stopped. The tradition at Merger was never passed on. The cultures that followed did not inherit it. The drills went back to the beads, and the knowledge of how to open a living tooth and let its owner walk away simply left the world. It had to be discovered again, from nothing, thousands of years later. The holes are still there, in the enamel, waiting in a museum tray. What is gone is the name of the first person who looked at another human being in pain and decided the answer was to drill. Number 9. The marks on the iceman. The body came out of a melting glacier in 1991, high on a rock ridge in the Ötztal Alps, on the border between Austria and Italy. 2 hikers found him lying face down in the ice. At first, everyone assumed he was a modern climber who had died in a storm. He was not. He was roughly 5,300 years old, and the cold had kept him so completely that his skin, his stomach contents, and his last meal were all still readable. His name, the one we gave him, is Otzi. He was about 45 when he died, killed by an arrow in the back and a blow to the head. And across his preserved skin, spread over his body, were 61 tattoos. They are not pictures. In 2015, the researcher Marco Samadelli and his colleagues mapped every one of them using multispectral imaging, which catches ink the naked eye misses. That work pushed the confirmed count to 61 marks arranged in 19 groups, more than earlier surveys had ever found. Almost all of them are short parallel lines. There are 2 small crosses, one on the right knee, one near the right ankle. They were not painted on. Someone had cut fine incisions into his skin and rubbed soot into the wounds. That is a slower and more painful way to be marked than any needle. And the placement is the part that has kept scientists arguing for 30 years. But here's where the lines stop looking decorative. When his body was scanned, the imaging found arthritis and joint wear underneath many of the tattoos. His lower back, his knees, his ankles, his wrist. The marks sit on the parts of him that hurt. More than that, roughly 80% of them fall on or beside points that classical Chinese medicine would later use for acupuncture, to treat the same aching joints, in a system not documented in Asia until some 2,000 years afterward. A cluster on his chest sits near points linked to the gut, and Otzi's gut was a wreck, carrying whipworm and a stomach infection. The pattern is hard to dismiss as chance. We should be careful here. No one can interview him. The tattoos might be therapeutic, or ritual, or a way of marking where the pain lived so it could be treated, and the argument is not settled. But if the simplest reading is right, it is the earliest sign we have of a human body deliberately marked in order to heal it. Not surgery to cut something out. Medicine written directly into the skin. There is one more reason to take the idea seriously. In modern times, a tattooist recreated Otzi's marks on a living volunteer with aching joints, placing them at the same points on the body. A year later, a practitioner judged that the treatment had produced a lasting effect. That is not proof of what happened 5,000 years ago, but it shows the method can do what the theory claims. The more disturbing thought is the number of them. Each of the 61 marks was a small wound, cut and blackened one at a time on a man who kept coming back for more. The soot is still legible on him, 5 millennia later, darker than the tissue around it. He was not relying on the marks alone. In his kit, threaded onto a leather strap, he carried birch fungus, which fights inflammation and may have been aimed at the parasites in his gut. The scans that found the arthritis found more besides. His arteries were already hardening, the earliest case of heart disease anyone can point to in a human body. His gallbladder held stones, and his gut carried parasites, so the marks inked over his aching joints were only one front in a much longer war. This was a man managing a failing body with everything his world knew, and the idea behind those marks never actually died. Put a sign where it hurts and treat that spot. It is sitting, in a slightly different form, in clinics that will see patients this afternoon. Number 8. The tooth sealed with wax. For more than 100 years, a broken piece of human jaw sat in a museum drawer in Trieste, in northern Italy, and no one noticed anything unusual about it. It had been dug from a cave near the village of Lons, in what is now Slovenia. It belonged to a man who had lived roughly 6,500 years ago, aged somewhere between 24 and 30. The jaw held a canine, 2 premolars and 2 molars, and it had lain fused into the hard calcite of a cave wall for thousands of years. In 2012, the physicist Federico Bernardini and his colleague Claudio Tunis used the jaw to test a new X-ray scanner. They were not looking for anything in particular. What the scan found was a lump of foreign material packed into one of the teeth. The tooth was the lower left canine, and it was in trouble. A vertical crack ran down through the enamel and into the dentin beneath, splitting the tooth along its length. The top of the crown had been worn flat, exposing the soft inner tissue that carries the nerve. Both of those problems make a tooth scream. Every touch of cold, every bite, every pressure. and both had been filled. The micro-CT scan showed the crack and the exposed cavity packed solid with a single substance, molded into place to seal the wound. The team ran it through infrared spectroscopy to find out what it was. The answer was beeswax. Someone had taken beeswax, a material Neolithic people used constantly as a glue and a sealant, and pressed it into a cracked tooth to close it off. It is the same logic a modern dentist uses to fill a cavity. Radiocarbon dating put both the wax and the tooth at around 6,500 years old. That makes this the earliest direct filling ever found, and, if it was done in life, the oldest sign anywhere of dentistry, meant simply to ease pain. It took a small arsenal of modern science to read one Neolithic tooth. The team scanned it with X-rays fine enough to model the crack in 3 dimensions. They dated it with accelerator mass spectrometry. They fingerprinted the filling with infrared light and an electron microscope. All of that to answer a question a Stone Age hand had already answered with a lump of wax. And it was a shrewd choice of material. Beeswax softens with warmth, packs into a cavity, then hardens and seals. It can survive for millennia. Whoever pressed it in understood, at least by instinct, exactly what that tooth needed. A canine sits at the front of the mouth, in the bite and in constant use, so a split one would have flared with every cold drink and every hard crust for as long as it lasted. Sealing it would have brought real relief. He was young, still in his 20s, so a split canine left untreated would have ground at him for decades. Every meal a small ordeal, which makes the wax less a nicety than a mercy. That instinct to close a wound and quiet the nerve is the whole root of dentistry. That leaves one thing the scans cannot settle. They can prove the wax is there. They can prove the tooth was cracked. What they cannot prove is when the wax went in. It may have been pressed into the crack while the man was still breathing, to let him chew without agony. It may have been packed in shortly after he died. For some reason, we cannot reach. A month either side of a death, 6,500 years ago, is beyond the resolution of any instrument we have. If the wax was a treatment, then a person here understood that a broken tooth could be sealed and soothed, and acted on it, long before anyone wrote a word about medicine. The filling survived. The mind behind it did not. And the jaw is a reminder of how much may still be sitting, unread, in the drawers of old museums. Number 7. The surgery performed on a cow. A French anthropologist named Fernando Ramirez Rossi was handed a skull in 2012 and asked to look again at a hole. The skull had come out of a Neolithic settlement called Champ-Durand in the Vendée on the Atlantic coast of western France. It was a fortified trading town that dealt in salt and cattle around 3,400 to 3000 BC. The salt was boiled from brine in clay vessels, and the trade in it made the place rich enough to raise ramparts around itself. The cranium was nearly complete, and it had a large opening in the right frontal bone. The hole measured about 6.4 by 4.6 centimeters, roughly the size of a small biscuit. When it was first dug up, decades earlier, an initial study had shrugged it off. The verdict then was goring, the kind of wound one animal leaves in another. Ramirez Rossi did not think it was a wound. He worked with the biological anthropologist, Alain Froment, at the Museum of Man in Paris, and he had spent years examining trepanned human skulls from Neolithic France. Trepanning is the surgical opening of the skull, cut into living people by prehistoric hands. He knew what those cuts looked like. This opening had no fractures running away from it. It had no crushing, none of the shattering a blow or a goring leaves. Instead, it showed the marks of scraping and cutting. Layers of bone had been worked away in careful stages, the slow way a hand works when it is trying not to punch straight through. They were the same techniques, applied the same way, that he had documented on human patients from the same period, except this skull did not belong to a person. It belonged to a cow. That single fact opens onto something uncomfortable about how these techniques were learned. There is no healing around the edge. So the animal did not survive the procedure, or was already dead when it was done. And that leaves two possibilities, both of which reshape the story. Either someone performed real surgery on a living cow, trying to save a valued animal, which would make this the oldest veterinary operation known. Or a person opened the skull of a cow in order to practice, to learn the feel of scraping through bone and stopping at the right depth. To rehearse before trying the same thing on a human being. How prehistoric people reached that level of skill is one of the real open questions of early medicine. The human trepanations from this period are often precise, and many of the patients lived. That kind of control is not born. It is learned. And a hole cut into a cow with the exact tools and the exact care of human surgery is the first physical hint of where the learning might have happened. Cattle made up more than half the animal bones at Champdurand. They were common. In a way, a person was not. So why would anyone go to the trouble of drilling into the head of a cow? The training answer is the uncomfortable one. It implies a curriculum. It implies that the survival rates we see on human skulls did not come from luck or instinct. It suggests they came from someone, somewhere, working out the technique on flesh that mattered less so it would hold when it mattered most. An older boar skull from another French site, studied back in 1948 and never dated, may point the same way. Set against the whole Neolithic record, a deliberate hole cut through an animal's skull with the exact tools of human surgery is almost without parallel. And that rarity is a large part of why the two readings, veterinary rescue or grim rehearsal, have been so hard to choose between. The cow's skull has no name and no story of its own. What it may carry is the outline of a lesson, the quiet, methodical figure of a person learning to cut a hole in a head and stop before the brain. The hand that practiced here is invisible. The practice is not. Number 6. The El Pendón skull. In a single-chamber stone tomb in the north of Spain, near the town of Reynoso in Burgos, a team from the University of Valladolid spent years lifting the bones of nearly 100 people out of a communal ossuary. The tomb, the Dolmen of El Pendón, was in use through the 4th millennium BC, roughly 3,800 to 3000 BC. Generations had returned to it, adding their dead across centuries. Among all those mingled remains, the archaeologists Manuel Rojo Guerra, Sonia Diaz Navarro, and Cristina Tejedor Rodriguez found one skull, discovered in 2018, that carried something none of the others did. Behind each ear, in the dense bone of the mastoid, there was a hole. The skull belonged to a woman who had lived to somewhere between 35 and 50. The mastoid, the bone just behind the human ear, is thick and honeycombed. It sits directly against the inner ear, and beyond that, the membranes of the brain. It is where a deep ear infection goes to fester. Untreated, in a world without antibiotics, that infection brings crushing pain, then hearing loss, then swelling that can reach the brain and kill. It was, in effect, a slow death sentence. The two openings in this woman's skull sit exactly over those infected chambers. On the left one, the researchers found cut marks along the front edge, the trace of a blade working at the bone. A flint blade recovered from the same tomb still carried marks of cutting into bone. What makes this find so nightmarish to picture is the method, and the fact that there were two of them. This was not a single wound. She had been operated on behind the right ear, and then, either back to back, or months or even years later behind the left. The surgery meant grinding progressively through living skull, right beside the ear. There was no anesthetic that we can confirm. The pain would have been so far beyond endurable that she was almost certainly held down, or given some plant strong enough to blunt a mind. There is nothing gentle about scraping into the bone of a conscious head. It is one of the more horrifying operations in this entire list. And it was performed on purpose twice, and she lived. That is the detail that turns the whole thing over. Around both openings, the bone had begun to grow back, smooth and remodeled. That regrowth only happens in a living body. It means she survived the first operation by at least a month, and then survived a second one on the other side. Someone opened her skull behind the ear, drained whatever was killing her, and she recovered in the Stone Age from an operation whose name we still use. No older ear surgery is known anywhere in the world. The people who confirmed what this was included working ear surgeons. The Valladolid team brought in specialists from a hospital ear department, and they recognized the operation at once because they still perform it. A mastoidectomy is a standard surgery today, done to clear infection from that same honeycomb of bone behind the ear. Modern surgeons do it with a drill, suction, and a microscope on a patient who is asleep. Someone did it here with a stone edge on a patient who was awake, and it worked. The healed bone is the whole record. The pain she carried before it, the pain of the operation itself, and the relief when the pressure finally broke are hers alone. They did not survive with her skull. Number 5. The grave at Ensisheim. In 1997, a short report appeared in the journal Nature that pushed the origins of European surgery back further than most people were ready to believe. The anthropologist Kurt Alt and his colleagues had been studying a Neolithic cemetery at Ensisheim in the Alsace region of eastern France. It was a burial ground of dozens of graves, dating to around 5,100 to 4,900 BC, some 7,000 years ago. One grave held a man of about 50, and in the top of his skull, there was a hole, cut cleanly through the bone, with no cracks running away from it, and none of the splintering that violence leaves. Trepanning, the surgical opening of the skull, is the oldest operation we can prove human beings ever performed. It reaches back even further than Ensisheim into the Mesolithic, with cut skulls from Ukraine dated to perhaps 9,000 or 10,000 years ago. More than 1,500 trepanned skulls survive from the Neolithic alone. They are scattered across Europe, Siberia, China, and the Americas. That means people who never met, who spoke unrelated languages and lived on different continents, all arrived at the same idea on their own. The way to treat a suffering head might be to open it. They did it by scraping the bone thin, or by drilling a ring of small holes and lifting out the disc, or by grooving a channel until the piece of skull came free. The Ensisheim man is not the first. He is one of the clearest. That word, clearest, is doing real work. Before Ensisheim, many holed skulls had been waved away as accidents, or as damage that crept in long after death. Alt's team argued that these two openings were the first case in Europe that could not be explained any other way. The bone had healed. A dead skull does not heal. And the practice was not some isolated freak. At one French burial ground, 40 of 120 skulls carried trepanning holes, though in that early period only around 4 patients in 10 survived the knife. And then Alt's team looked again and realized the man had not one hole in his head, but 2. One of them, toward the front of the skull, measured about 6 centimeters across and had healed completely, the edges rounded and closed. The second was enormous, close to 9 centimeters wide, a window cut into the top of the skull by scoring intersecting lines and lifting out a rectangle of bone. That one had only partly healed by the time he died. So the sequence runs like this. He was trepanned once. He survived. The bone grew back. And then, at some later point, someone opened his skull a second time, far more drastically. And he survived that too. He lived on with a hand-sized gap in the roof of his head. An opening that wide, close to 9 centimeters, left a broad stretch of his brain covered by nothing but skin, a soft spot over the mind that he carried for whatever time he had left. Think about what each of those operations demanded. The skull had to be scraped or cut through by hand, layer by layer, while the man stayed alive and still. If the surgeon slipped, the membranes just beneath the bone would tear. Getting a patient through that once in 5000 BC is difficult to explain. Getting the same patient through it twice means the first success was not an accident. Someone knew how deep to go. Someone knew how to keep the wound from killing him. And someone did it again. Why, we cannot say. In cultures that still practice trepanation into modern times, the reason split two ways: to relieve pressure after a head injury, and to drive out headaches, seizures, or spirits nobody could see. Some of those cultures kept the disc of removed bone and wore it as a charm. The man at Ensisheim carries both holes and no explanation. What his skull proves is the how, not the why. He survived a surgery that should have killed him. Then he trusted the same hands enough, or hurt badly enough, to let them do it again. Number 4. The skulls opened in the same place. In 2016, the German anthropologist Julia Gresky and a team of colleagues published a study in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology. It gathered a set of skulls from southern Russia, from the region around Rostov-on-Don, dating across the 5th to 3rd millennia. BC, 13 individuals, from several separate sites, each with a hole scraped clean through the skull. On its own, a trepanned skull is not rare. What made this group extraordinary was that all of them had been opened in exactly the same spot. The link was almost missed. 2 decades earlier, a Russian researcher named Elena Batieva had noticed a cluster of these strange skulls near Rostov-on-Don and described them. Years later, Gresky happened to read that work and saw the same pattern in skulls she was studying herself. When they pooled their records, the coincidence became impossible to ignore. Opening the skull at this point is vanishingly rare everywhere else on Earth. For 13 cases to surface in one small region could not easily be chance. It pointed to a shared tradition, and perhaps a single place where this was taught. The spot is called the obelion. It sits high on the back of the head, on the midline, and it is one of the most dangerous places on the entire skull to cut. Directly beneath the bone, there runs a large vein, part of the drainage that carries blood away from the brain. This channel is the superior sagittal sinus, a broad river of venous blood running the length of the midline, and it is not a vessel a hand can pinch shut once it is opened, so a single slip there floods the wound faster than anyone could hope to staunch it. Cut the skull there, and the bleeding can be catastrophic. Surgeons who trepanned for medical reasons tended to avoid it. Across the whole global record of trepanation, fewer than 1 hole in 100 is placed at the obelion, and yet here were 13 people in one corner of Russia, all opened at precisely that point, using only scraping and grooving, the tools of a careful hand. But here's where the medical explanation falls apart. Gresky's team examined every skull by eye, by X-ray, and by CT scan. They found no fractures, no tumors, no disease, nothing wrong with any of these heads that a hole would treat. These were not injured people. They were, as far as their bones can tell, healthy, which leaves a single, deeply unsettling question hanging over all of them. Why would people who were not sick and not hurt choose the one location on the skull most likely to kill them, and open it anyway? The researchers think the answer is not medicine, but ritual. One expert on Russian trepanation, Maria Mendikova, has argued that cutting the skull in these forbidden, dangerous places may have been a way of seeking a transformation. A way of trying to become something other than an ordinary member of the group, to gain some standing or power that only the surgery could confer. 6 other skulls at the same sites were open near fractures, and those look medical. These 13 do not. At one site, 5 adults and an adolescent girl were buried together in a single pit, their skulls arranged with bundles of limb bones in what looks like a deliberate display. All of them bore the obelion hole. The limb bones stacked with them had been cut from the bodies after death, part of some rite we can no longer read. The girl was between 14 and 16 when she died. She had been trepanned by the age of 12 or younger, and most of them lived. Of the 13, the majority show new bone growing around the opening, the sign of survival, healing for months or years after the blade went in. So we are left with a group of healthy people, including a child, who let someone scrape a hole through the deadliest part of the skull for reasons that were not medical and who mostly walked away from it. The holes are precise, most of them the width of a silver dollar. The belief that drove all of it, the thing worth risking death at the back of the skull to reach, is completely lost. We can measure the wound. We cannot read the reason. Number 3. The Bouthiers-Boulancourt burial. Ahead of a sand quarry about 70 kilometers south of Paris. In 2005, a team of French archaeologists from the National Institute INRAP opened a grave they labeled Burial 416. It sat in an early Neolithic settlement at Bouthiers-Boulancourt, dated to around 4,900 to 4,700 BC, roughly 6,900 years ago. This was a farming community of longhouses, one of the early cultures that spread across Europe as agriculture arrived, growers of wheat and barley who raised long timber halls in rows. Inside the grave lay an elderly man, and beside him lay the kind of goods that mark a person of standing. A polished stone axe near his skull. A heavy flint pick, some 30 centimeters long, laid over his left arm. That left arm is why the excavation, led by Cécile Bouquet-Marchand, would become one of the most important surgical finds in Europe. The forearm was gone. At first, a missing bone in a 7,000-year-old grave means very little because bones scatter and rot. But Bouquet-Marchand worked with the forensic specialist Philippe Charlier, and when they examined the upper arm, they saw that it had not simply broken or decayed. The humerus ended in a clean cut just above the elbow, and the end of the cut bone had healed. The edge was smoothed and closed over, remodeled the way living bone remodels when the body has time to repair itself. Someone had removed this man's forearm, deliberately, with a cutting edge, and he had survived it. For years, this was the oldest amputation known anywhere in the world. What deepens it is everything around the wound. The cut sits above the elbow, which is not where you lose an arm by accident. The surface is even, the work of a tool driven with intent, not a crush or a bite. And there is no sign of the infection that should have followed an open amputation in a world with no antiseptics and no notion of germs. The wound was kept clean enough, somehow, to close. An older body mends slowly, the bones already growing brittle and the defenses thinned by the years. So for an elderly man to seal a wound like that and go on living was a far steeper climb than it would have been for someone young. Researchers have suggested the surgeon may have used a plant to dull the pain and something to hold off the rot, though we cannot prove which. This man also carried arthritis so advanced it had polished the bone of his neck vertebrae. He was old. He had one arm, and he was still here. There is an old idea that the first sign of civilization is not a tool or a temple, but a healed thigh bone. A broken leg means weeks of helplessness. Surviving it means someone else chose to help. This grave is that idea made real, and then some. A limb here was not merely splinted. It was cut away in a controlled operation above the joint, with the arm most likely raised to open the elbow to the blade. And then the man was carried through the aftermath. That is the detail that reaches forward across 7,000 years. A one-armed elder in an early farming village was not left behind. Someone amputated his arm and nursed the wound. Someone fed him and sheltered him through a recovery that would have taken months. When he could not work, could not hunt, could not carry, and when he finally died, an old man, they buried him with a fine axe and a great blade of flint. The goods of someone who mattered. His disability did not push him out of the group. The community carried him. Long before writing, before cities, before medicine had a name, people were making a decision that still defines our species. The decision to spend enormous effort keeping alive a person who could give nothing back but their presence. The healed bone proves the surgery. The axe and the long flint blade prove something harder to excavate. They prove that he was valued, right to the end. Number 2, the civilization that perfected brain surgery. More than 800 ancient skulls with holes cut into them have come out of the ground in Peru, from the desert coast and the high valleys of the Andes. That is more trepanned skulls than the rest of the world has produced combined. The earliest come from the Paracas culture of the southern coast, around 400 BC. In 2018, the neurologist David Kushner, the bioarchaeologist John Verano, and the anthropologist Anne Titelbaum published a study in the journal World Neurosurgery that did something no single skull could do. They lined the Peruvian skulls up across time from those first cases through to the height of the Inca in the 1500s, and they measured how often the patients lived. The measure is simple and grim. If a hole in a skull shows no healing, the person died on the table, or soon after. If the bone around the hole is smooth and grown over, they survived. And when the team sorted the skulls by age, a curve appeared that reads like a civilization teaching itself. In the earliest period, around 400 to 200 BC, only about 40% of trepanation patients survived. Worse than a coin flip. Over the following centuries, the rate climbed. By around 1000 to 1400 AD, it reached as high as 91% in some samples. By the Inca era, it averaged between 75 and 83%. What makes those numbers so startling is what they were beating. Cranial surgery during the American Civil War in the 1860s, with metal instruments and trained doctors, killed somewhere between 46 and 56% of patients. Most of them died of infection, from dirty hands and dirty tools in crowded field hospitals. The surgeons of ancient Peru were working with blades of obsidian and no theory of germs at all, and they were losing far fewer. By the raw survival math, they were better at opening a human skull than the trained physicians of a war 3,000 years later. They did not get there by magic. They got there the way any skill is mastered, across generations. Master to apprentice, each surgeon learning from the deaths of the ones before. The technique itself tells the story. The early skulls have large, deep, dangerous openings. The later ones have smaller, shallower holes, work so as to scrape down close to the brain's covering membrane without ever piercing it, cutting away from the great blood vessels, keeping the wound small. They favored open air and freshly struck obsidian, which is naturally close to sterile. They may have packed the wounds with plant compounds that fight infection. The coca leaf grew all through their world, and its power to numb was long known and used. So there is a real chance the patient on the table had been given something for the pain, chewed or pressed against the gum, taking the edge off an operation that would otherwise sit past the limit of bearing. Some Inca skulls carry as many as 7 separate trepanations, and every one of them is healed. The same person, open 7 times, and alive after each. The scale of it is easy to miss. In and around the old Inca capital of Cuzco, one survey of more than 400 skulls found 66 with surgical holes, and at a single site, a third of the skulls had been opened. This was not rare surgery. It was a common answer to a common problem. Most of the patients were adult men, and the reason is written on the bones themselves. War. Slingstones and spiked clubs cracked skulls, and opening the head let out the pressure of the bleeding underneath. This is the thing to sit with. Trepanation was not, in Peru, a wild and occasional gamble. It was a mature medical practice, refined over more than 1,000 years into a procedure that most people survived. A body of hard-won knowledge that was taught, passed down, and improved. The operation never actually left medicine. Open a skull today to drain a bleed on the brain, and the basic act is the one these surgeons refined. A window cut in bone to save the life beneath it. And then the Spanish arrived. The culture that carried the knowledge was shattered, and the chain of teaching between surgeon and apprentice ended. The skulls remained, hundreds of them, with their smooth-healed windows. The living tradition that made those healings routine, the accumulated understanding of how to open a head and give it back, was broken and did not come again. What survived is the outcome. What was lost is the method that made the outcome ordinary. Number 1. The surgery at the end of the Ice Age. In March 2020, In the days just before the world's borders closed for the pandemic, a team of Indonesian and Australian archaeologists, led by Tim Maloney, was digging in the floor of a vast limestone cave. The cave is called Liang Tebo, and it stands in East Kalimantan on the island of Borneo. It is remote, reachable only by boat at certain times of year, and its walls carry some of the oldest figurative rock art on Earth, painted around 40,000 years ago. Under the cave floor, the team found a grave. In it lay a young person, buried with care, most of the skeleton intact, and the lower part of the left leg, the shin in the foot, was missing. A missing foot could mean 100 things, most of them dull. An animal, an accident, a bone lost in the ground over 30,000 years. So the team looked hard at where the leg ended, and what they saw ruled all of that out. The remaining leg bones, the lower tibia and fibula, ended in a clean, angled surface. That surface had healed. It was sealed over with a new bone, the kind of growth clinicians see today in the stumps of amputees. There was no break, no crushing, none of the ragged trauma an animal attack leaves. The foot and lower leg had not been torn away. They had been removed, cleanly, on purpose, and the person had lived. Then they dated it. Charcoal from the sediment above and below the grave placed the burial at least 31,000 years ago. A separate method, run directly on one of the skeleton's teeth, agreed. Bone growth over the amputation showed the patient had survived the operation and lived another 6 to 9 years afterward. The individual, probably in their late teens or 20s at death, appears to have lost the leg as a child. Let those numbers settle for a moment. This is the oldest surgery of any kind ever found. And until this grave was opened, the earliest amputation we knew of was the one-armed elder in France, at around 6,900 years. Borneo pushed the date back by more than 24,000 years, into the middle of the last ice age. The truly haunting part is what the surgery required, in that place, at that time. To take off a lower leg and keep the patient alive, a great deal had to go right. Someone had to cut through skin and muscle. They had to find the major arteries and veins, and close them so the child did not bleed to death. They had to sever the bone. They had to carry the patient through the shock. And then came the hardest part of all. The open wound had to be kept from infection for weeks in a tropical rainforest crawling with bacteria. This happened tens of thousands of years before the first farm, the first city, the first written word. How do you do that? With stone tools and nothing we would recognize as medicine. We do not know what they cut with. We do not know what held off the rot. But the forests of Borneo are full of plants with real antiseptic power. And these were people who had lived in that forest for a very long time and knew it in a way we no longer can. One local fruit, poisonous if eaten raw, turns into a wound treatment once it is properly prepared, and they would have known such things, the way we know which cabinet holds the bandages. For most of the last century, the story of medicine had a clean beginning. Complex healing, the argument went, was born with farming, around 10,000 years ago, when we settled down and crowded together and fell sick in new ways. Everything before that was assumed to be simpler, more brutal, closer to bare survival. This one grave breaks that story in half. It says that a band of hunter-gatherers, more than 30,000 years ago, understood the human body well enough to remove part of it and keep the person breathing. And then they cared for that child through a recovery that took years. And when the child finally died, as a young adult, they laid the body in the ground with deliberate tenderness. That is not a lost civilization or a distant species. That is us, our own kind, doing the oldest recognizably human thing there is. The knowledge those Ice Age surgeons carried, the exact way they closed a wound and beat an infection with nothing but stone and plants and skill, is gone. We may never recover it. What they left behind is a young skeleton with a healed stump, buried by people who refused to let a maimed child die. The will to cut and heal and carry the wounded is older than farming. It is older than history. It is older than nearly everything we thought we knew about ourselves. It is in you, in the reflex that pulls you toward a stranger who has fallen, in the quiet assumption that a hurt person should be helped and not left behind. It was already inside us at the edge of the Ice Age. It is inside us still. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now, and make sure to subscribe.